The wind in Wyoming doesn't just blow, it screams. On Christmas Eve, it was screaming Jacob Carter's name, whipping snow and sand into needles that tore at his skin. He stood in front of the sheriff's office, a ghost in the growing twilight, his eyes locked on a thin ribbon of smoke staining the sky to the west. Fire. A man like Jacob Carter knows what fire means. It means trouble. It means a line shack torched and a message sent. It means Silas Reynolds was poking the bear again, daring him to come out of his cave. He could have. He could have saddled the fastest horse on his ranch, gathered his men, and ridden into the teeth of that storm to meet violence with violence. He had every right, but he'd made a promise. His daughter Annie had made him swear. No business, Papa, no blood feuds. Not on Christmas Eve. She wanted to see the town tree, drink hot cocoa, and pretend for one night that their world wasn't built on hard ground and harder men. A Carter's word was iron, so he crushed his cigarillo into a drift of snow, the last spark of his anger dying with it. He turned to his wagon, where Annie sat kicking her small, impatient feet. She was 5 years old, with her mother's gold curls and a stubborn streak a mile wide. "Papa, we'll miss it," she called, her voice sharp as the wind. "Stop glowering at smoke." A smile almost touched Jacob's lips. "That smoke is trouble, sweetheart," he murmured, climbing onto the seat beside her. "But you're right. Tonight, trouble can wait." The wagon wheels crunched on the frozen street. Light spilled from the windows of the general store and the saloon. Laughter floated on the air, thin but defiant. Even on the frontier, Christmas had a way of fighting back against the dark. Jacob tipped his hat to the preacher, a hollow gesture. His own faith had been buried 5 years ago, on a windswept hill next to his wife Sarah. She died bringing their son into the world, a boy who never drew a single breath. He'd buried them both, and a part of himself along with them. His ranch had grown since then. His herds had multiplied. But the main house, for all its size, was just a shell, an empty monument to what he'd lost. "Papa, look!" Annie's voice was a whisper. Jacob followed her gaze to the train depot at the far end of the street. A figure was hunched on a bench under a flickering gas lamp, a small, dark shape against the swirling snow. At first he thought it was a bundle of rags. Then the bundle moved. A faint sound drifted toward them, a whimper too weak to fight the wind. It was a girl, barely more than that, with tangled hair and a face as pale as bone. And in her arms, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, was a baby. Snowflakes clung to the infant's lashes. Its tiny chest barely moved. Jacob's gut clenched into a knot of ice. He'd seen full-grown men freeze to death in a night like this. This was a child, an innocent. "Papa," Annie whispered, her voice urgent. "He's freezing. We have to help." Jacob pulled the wagon closer, his jaw tight. Kindness was a currency he couldn't afford. A stranger was a risk, and a risk was something Silas Reynolds could twist into a weapon. Every instinct screamed caution, but Annie was already climbing down. She waded through the snow, her small form fearless and determined. "Ma'am," she said, her voice clear as a bell, "your baby is getting sick." The girl's head snapped up. Her eyes were wide, blue, and terrified. "Don't take him," she rasped, clutching the bundle tighter. "Please." Jacob held up his hands. "Easy now. No one's taking your boy." He knelt in the snow, the lamplight carving deep lines into his face. "But you can't stay here. The cold will kill him before morning." Her lips trembled, a mix of defiance and despair. "I don't need charity." Jacob looked at her, the hollow cheeks, the raw, cracked fingers, the clothes that hung on her like a scarecrow's. She was drowning in pride, but her desperation was a fire he could feel from 10 feet away. Annie tugged on his coat. "Papa, please. Mama wouldn't leave a baby in the cold." The words were a knife in his gut. He could hear Sarah's voice in the wind, a soft echo from a life ago. "Promise me, Jacob. Teach her kindness above all else." He unwound his own thick wool scarf and gently wrapped it around the baby. The infant stirred, a fragile flutter of life against his calloused hands. As he lifted the child, the warmth of his own body met the deathly cold of the tiny form. "His name is Noah," the girl whispered, her voice breaking. "And yours?" "Grace. Grace Miller." She swayed as she stood, every bone in her body protesting the movement. Jacob nodded once, his decision made. I'm Jacob Carter. My ranch is 3 miles out of town. You'll come with us tonight. He saw the fear in her eyes, the instinct to run, to... But then she looked at Annie, who had reached out a small, mittened hand. Grace's shoulders slumped. She let out a breath she'd been holding for what looked like a lifetime. Jacob helped her into the wagon. The baby, Noah, was a feather lightweight in his arms, his breathing shallow but steady. As they rode out of town, the snow fell thicker, swallowing the last of the light. To everyone else, it was Christmas Eve. For Jacob Carter, it was the night the ghost of his past came riding in on the storm. The ranch house was a fortress of light against the swirling dark. Smoke curled from two great stone chimneys, promising a warmth Grace couldn't remember feeling. It looked too big, too safe, a place she didn't belong. Jacob guided the wagon past the main house toward a small, secluded cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees. A single lantern swung over the door, casting long, dancing shadows. "This will be yours for the night," he said, his voice rough as he helped her down. Inside, a fire was already crackling in the hearth. The air smelled of cedar and clean linen. A bed piled high with quilts stood against one wall, and a small table held bread and butter. Grace stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell. "It's not much, but it's warm," Jacob said. "You and the boy will be safe here." Her lips trembled. "Why?" Jacob's gaze was weary, but it didn't waver. "Because a child freezing on Christmas Eve isn't something a man walks away from. That's all the reason I need." Noah let out a soft whimper, and the sound broke through Grace's fear. She rushed to the bed, unwrapping him from the layers of cloth. For the first time, a faint touch of pink colored his cheeks. Relief washed over her so fiercely it made her knees weak. Jacob added another log to the fire. "Mrs. Hill will bring supplies in the morning." Grace tensed. "Mrs. Hill?" "My housekeeper," he said. His tone was clipped. "She keeps things in order." And his tone suggested that strangers were the definition of disorder. "She won't want me here," Grace whispered, suddenly aware of the grime on her dress, the tangled mess of her hair. "Maybe not," Jacob admitted. "But this is my ranch. My word stands." Their eyes met, and in his, Grace saw more than just power. She saw a profound loneliness, an emptiness as vast and cold as the plains outside. She looked away, not wanting him to see the same desolation in her own soul. Annie had slipped in behind them and was watching from a stool by the fire. "Is Noah going to be okay?" Grace's expression softened. "Yes, sweetheart. He just needed to be warm." Annie nodded, then looked at her father. "Can we bring them cookies tomorrow? Mama used to say guests should always have cookies." A muscle jumped in Jacob's jaw. He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway as the wind howled around him. "Rest tonight. We'll talk tomorrow." The door closed, and the silence in the cabin was deafening. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her sleeping son. She had stumbled into a sanctuary, a moment of impossible grace, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that sanctuaries on the frontier were never free. Mercy always came with a price. Across the yard, Jacob carried a sleeping Annie up the steps of the main house. A tall, silver-haired woman stood waiting, her face etched with disapproval. "Another mouth to feed?" Mrs. Hill asked, her voice as crisp as the winter air. Jacob's gaze flickered to the faint glow from the cabin. "Two," he said, and walked past her into the house. Mrs. Hill watched him go, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. She had served the Carter family for 20 years. She had seen trouble come in many forms. But this girl, with her haunted eyes and her nameless child, felt different. This felt like the beginning of an end. In the cabin, Grace huddled by the fire. She unwrapped Noah's tiny hand, tracing the perfect, miniature fingers. Tears she didn't know she had left began to fall, hot against her cold skin. "We made it, my little snowbird," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "We're safe tonight." But as she said the words, a coyote cried out on the ridge, a long, lonely sound that echoed the fear in her own heart. Safety was an illusion, and she had a terrible feeling she'd just brought the storm right to Jacob Carter's door. Dawn broke over the ranch like a fresh wound, pale and cold. Grace woke with a start, the softness of the mattress feeling foreign and wrong against her aching bones. She was used to hard ground, to the constant gnawing chill. Comfort felt like a trap. A sharp knock on the cabin door made her jump. Before she could answer, the door swung open and Mrs. Hill swept in, a basket on her arm and judgment in her eyes. "You must be Grace Miller," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I keep Mr. Carter's household in order, and I do not abide disorder." Grace felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't ask to be here." "No," Mrs. Hill said, setting the basket down. It was filled with eggs, bread, and ham. "He brought you, against my counsel." Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned every corner of the cabin. "I've seen girls like you before. Lost things with sad stories, looking to plant themselves where they don't belong." "I'm not looking for pity," Grace shot back, her voice trembling. "Only to keep my baby alive." For a single fleeting moment, Mrs. Hill's gaze softened as it fell on Noah. "The child is innocent, whatever your choices." Then the frost returned. "There's soap and water. Use them. Supper's at 6. You'll eat in the kitchen." With that, she was gone, leaving the cabin feeling colder than before. Later, Jacob appeared, dusting snow from his coat. In the daylight, he seemed even larger, a man carved from the unforgiving land itself. But his eyes were surprisingly gentle as he looked at Noah. "How did he sleep?" "Better than me," Grace admitted, then wished she could take the words back. She didn't want his pity. "Thank you for everything. I'll work to earn my keep." Jacob studied her, seeing the fragile pride warring with sheer exhaustion. "We'll find something for you to do." He walked her through the ranch yard, a sprawling kingdom of barns and corrals. The ranch hands tipped their hats, but their eyes were filled with a curiosity that felt like a physical touch. Grace could already feel their whispers gathering like storm clouds. As they passed a corral, Annie came running out of the main house, her cheeks red from the cold. "Miss Grace, do you like horses?" Grace managed a genuine smile. "I love them. When I was a girl, I used to sketch them." Annie's eyes went wide. "You can draw? Will you draw one for me?" Jacob watched them, a strange expression on his face. Annie hadn't asked anyone about drawing since her mother, since Sarah. Grace felt his stare. She looked from the hopeful little girl to the haunted man and nodded. "When I have paper, I'll show you." That evening, Grace sat in the vast, warm kitchen, an outsider at a feast. The ranch hands ate loudly, but from the next room she could hear Jacob's low laugh and Annie's bright chatter. It was a world away, a life she could see but never touch. Then Annie snuck in, clutching a scrap of paper and a pencil stub. "I found these," she whispered. Grace's fingers, stiff from the cold and disuse, felt clumsy at first, but then the old instincts took over. In a few quick, sure strokes, a colt with a wild mane and kicking legs appeared on the paper. Annie gasped with delight. Even Mrs. Hill, who missed nothing, paused to peer over her shoulder. "You have a talent," she conceded, her tone grudging. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Grace felt like a person, not just a problem, but trouble travels fast in a small town. The next day at the general store, Grace overheard two women talking in hushed, venomous tones. "Carter's taken in a stray, a widow, they say, or maybe not a widow at all. Shameful. With a young daughter in the house. Reynolds was right. The man's lost his senses." Grace kept her head down, but their words were like brands on her skin. When she stepped outside, Jacob was waiting by the wagon, his jaw set like stone. He'd heard them too. "Pay them no mind," he said, his voice clipped. "They'll hurt your reputation," she whispered. His eyes burned with a cold fire. "Let them try." But back at the ranch, as snow began to fall again, dread coiled in Grace's stomach. Jacob was a powerful man, but she knew firsthand that a reputation could be destroyed by nothing more than a whisper. She was a ghost, a liability, and she feared she was dragging him down into the darkness with her. That night in the saloon, Silas Reynolds slid a stack of coins across the table to the local newspaper editor. I want a front-page story, Reynolds said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Let's find out just how much scandal Jacob Carter's good name can withstand. The editor pocketed the coins. By morning, the whispers would become a roar, and Grace knew, with a sickening certainty, that the storm she'd brought to the Carter Ranch was about to break. The headlines screamed from the front page of the Wyoming Gazette: "Wealthy rancher harbors woman of questionable past. Scandal or charity?" Jacob read the words and his hands clenched, crushing the flimsy paper into a tight ball. The article was filled with insinuation, painting him as a fool blinded by grief and Grace as a scheming opportunist. It was Reynolds's work, as clear as a brand on cattle. Grace didn't need to see the paper. She could feel it in the air. The ranch hands avoided her eyes. Mrs. Hill's silence was sharper than any blade. Even Annie seemed to sense the shift, clinging to Grace's skirt with a worried frown. "Why is everyone looking at us funny?" the little girl asked. Grace forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand." That afternoon, Jacob announced they were going into town. Grace's stomach twisted into a knot of pure dread, but she refused to hide. She needed medicine for Noah's cough. And more than that, she needed to show Reynolds and the whole town that she would not be broken by whispers. The town felt like a gauntlet. Every face that turned toward them was a mask of suspicion or pity. At the Mercantile, the shopkeeper's wife hesitated, wringing her hands. "It's just, it's not proper, dear, with Mr. Carter's daughter to think of." Jacob's voice cut through the tense silence like a whip crack. "My daughter has more decency than this entire town. She judges a person by their character, not by the lies printed in a newspaper." The room went quiet. Grace's cheeks burned, but she stood tall, held upright by the sheer force of his will. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, a smooth, mocking voice stopped them cold. Silas Reynolds leaned against a post, a fat cigar in his hand. "Quite the spectacle, Carter, parading your charity case around for all to see. You've built an empire, but one bad choice can bring the whole thing down." His eyes slid over Grace, cold and appraising. "Especially a choice that bears such a resemblance." Resemblance. The word hit Grace like a physical blow. He meant Sarah, Jacob's dead wife. Jacob took a step forward, his shadow falling over Reynolds. "Keep my wife's name out of your mouth." Reynolds chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "The truth hurts, doesn't it? This town will have to decide which one of us is the better man. And I have a feeling they won't side with the man who brings a whore into his home." Before Jacob could lunge, Grace grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't," she whispered. "This is what he wants." Jacob's body was rigid with fury, but he let her pull him away. The ride back to the ranch was silent and heavy. The moment they walked through the door, Mrs. Hill was on them. "This has gone too far, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice shaking with rare emotion. "Your name, this family's name, is being dragged through the mud. That girl's troubles are not your own." Grace felt the words like daggers. "She's right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I should leave. I'm bringing ruin to you." Jacob turned on her, his eyes blazing. "And go where? Back to that bench? Let Reynolds win?" "No, you're staying. This is your home now." His words should have been a comfort, but looking at the fire in his eyes, Grace felt a new kind of fear. This was no longer about charity. It had become personal. He was fighting for her, and she knew that men like Silas Reynolds didn't stop until their enemies had lost everything. That night, Grace rocked Noah by the fire, her mind racing. She had found a protector in Jacob Carter, but what she had really found was a man willing to go to war for her, and she was terrified that the price of that war would be his utter destruction. She looked down at her sleeping son. She had brought him into a world that wanted to crush them, but then she thought of Jacob's unwavering defense, of Annie's unquestioning love. She wouldn't run, not this time. She looked out the window, toward the main house. A single light burned in Jacob's study. He was awake too, waiting. The battle lines had been drawn. The whispers had failed. Now Reynolds would have to use a different weapon. And Grace knew, with a cold, sinking feeling, that the next attack would not be with words. It would be with fire and blood. The silence that fell over the ranch in the following days was thick and heavy, the calm before a storm. Jacob rode the fences relentlessly, his face a grim mask. He was preparing for a war. Grace, however, refused to be a damsel in the tower. She rose with the sun, strapped Noah to her chest, and found work where she could. She mended clothes, tended the kitchen garden under its winter blanket, and slowly, quietly, began to weave herself into the fabric of the ranch. One morning, Annie dragged her to the barn to see a newborn colt, a tiny, trembling thing on spindly legs. "Won't last the night," one of the hands grumbled. "Too weak." But Grace knelt by the colt, her touch gentle, her voice a low murmur. She spent the day with the animal, rubbing its legs, coaxing it to nurse, whispering words of encouragement. The ranch hands watched, their skepticism slowly turning to a grudging respect. By nightfall, the colt was standing, wobbly but alive. Jacob found her there in the lantern-lit barn, a small, tired smile on her face. "She saved him," a ranch hand told him, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never seen anything like it." Jacob looked at Grace, truly looked at her, and saw not the lost girl from the depot, but a woman with a strength as quiet and unyielding as the mountains themselves. Later, he found her outside the cabin, staring up at the star-dusted sky. "You have a way with lost causes," he said, his voice low. She turned, startled. "I'm just trying not to be trouble." "You're more than that," he said, stepping closer. The air between them crackled. "Annie hasn't been this happy in years. The men, they respect you. I respect you." He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that she had brought life back into his hollow home, that he hadn't felt this alive since before Sarah. But the words were locked behind years of grief. Grace's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the unspoken words hanging between them. She wanted to lean into his strength, to let herself believe the sanctuary was real. But her past was a ghost that never slept. "I don't know how long I can stay," she whispered. "This all feels borrowed." Before Jacob could answer, a new sound cut through the night. The thunder of hooves, too many to count. The panicked lowing of cattle. He was moving before the first shout went up. "Reynolds!" Lanterns flared across the yard. Men ran from the bunkhouse, rifles in hand. Grace's blood ran cold. The far fence line had been cut, and a dozen riders were driving a huge portion of Jacob's herd out into the darkness. "Get riders out!" Jacob roared, swinging onto his horse. "Track them down." Grace grabbed his arm. "Don't go! It's a trap!" His eyes, burning with cold fury, met hers. "They think they can break me by stealing what's mine. They're about to learn how wrong they are." He spurred his horse into the night, his men following close behind. Grace was left standing in the freezing yard, the sound of Noah's crying drifting from the cabin. This was it. The war had begun. She herded a terrified Annie inside, huddling with the children by the fire. She was no longer just a guest. She was part of this now. Her fate was tied to the fate of the Carter Ranch. Hours later, Jacob returned. He was covered in mud and blood, a deep gash on his cheek. They had recovered most of the cattle, but two of his men were wounded. Grace rushed to him, dabbing at the cut on his face with a damp cloth. Her touch was gentle, and for a moment, he let his guard down. The full weight of his burdens showed in the weary lines around his eyes. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice grim. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't gratitude. It was a shared understanding. They were both fighters, both survivors, and they were standing on the same side of the line. "Then we'll be ready," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jacob looked at her, at this woman who had drifted into his life on a snowstorm, and realized she was no longer a weakness for Reynolds to exploit. She was his most trusted ally. And as he looked deeper, past the fear and the hardship, he felt a flicker of something he thought had been buried forever. It was a dangerous, fragile thing. It felt a lot like hope. The next day, Jacob found something that turned that hope to ice. He was cleaning out the wagon she had arrived in, and tucked deep within a fold of the worn seat canvas, he found a small, leather-bound journal. He knew he shouldn't open it. It was a violation of her trust, the very trust they had just begun to build. But a terrible premonition, A cold dread that had nothing to do with Silas Reynolds compelled him. He opened it. The handwriting was delicate, familiar in a way that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The first few pages were simple entries about travel, about the biting cold, about the gnawing hunger. But then he saw a name, his name, Jacob Carter, and then another, Sarah. His blood ran cold. He read on, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The journal wasn't Grace's. The entries were dated over 5 years ago. They described a young woman, terrified and in love, who was about to marry a powerful rancher. A man she admired but also feared. A man named Jacob Carter. The last entry was dated the day before his wife, Sarah, had supposedly died in childbirth. "He will never let me go," the entry read. "He controls everything. The ranch, the town, me. My only hope is Dr. Albright. He has a plan. He says it's the only way to be free. The only way to save my baby." Jacob stumbled back, the journal falling from his numb fingers. It was Sarah's journal. And the woman in his cabin, the woman he was starting to feel something for, the woman who looked at him with those haunted blue eyes. She wasn't Grace Miller. She was an imposter, and he had brought her right into the heart of his home. The air in Jacob's study was thick with the smell of whiskey and betrayal. He stared at the journal lying open on his desk, Sarah's elegant script mocking him from the page. "He will never let me go." The words were a brand on his soul. He had loved her, or he thought he had. Looking back now, through the lens of this journal, he saw a different picture. He saw his grief not as love, but as possession. He saw his protection as a cage. And the woman in the cabin, who was she? He stormed out of the house, the winter wind a poor match for the storm raging inside him. He burst into the cabin without knocking. Grace was sitting by the fire, sketching on a piece of scrap paper while Annie watched, mesmerized. She looked up, a smile on her face, but it vanished when she saw the look in his eyes. "Get Annie out of here," he said to Mrs. Hill, who had just entered with a tray. His voice was dangerously quiet. Mrs. Hill, ever perceptive, took one look at his face, gathered Annie's hand, and left without a word. Jacob threw the journal onto the small table between them. "Whose is this?" Grace stared at it, her face draining of all color. She looked like a ghost. "I asked you a question," he growled. Her voice was a choked whisper. "Where did you get that?" "It was in the wagon, the one you arrived in. It's my wife's journal." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a raw, wounded hiss. "My dead wife. So I'll ask you again. Who are you?" Tears streamed down her face, silent and devastating. "My name is Grace." "Stop lying to me," he roared, slamming his fist on the table. Noah, asleep in a makeshift cradle, began to cry. "My name is Grace," she repeated, her voice shaking but gaining a sliver of strength. "I am Sarah's sister." The confession hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, leaning against the doorframe for support. Sarah had a sister, a younger sister she had mentioned only in passing, someone left behind in St. Louis. "She sent for me," Grace continued, her voice thick with grief. "Months before she died. She wrote me letters. She was afraid of you, Jacob. She said you were possessive, controlling, that you saw her as another one of your prize mares to be kept in a gilded cage." Every word was a nail in his coffin. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Grace shot back, her own anger flaring to life. "She faked her death to escape you. Dr. Albright helped her. They planned to meet, to run away with the baby. But she never showed up. She vanished. And you buried an empty coffin on that hill." Jacob's world tilted on its axis. An empty coffin. Sarah, alive. "I came here to find out what happened to her," Grace said, her eyes blazing with accusation. "To find out if you discovered her plan and silenced her for good. I came here for justice." He stared at her, at the impossible resemblance to Sarah that had haunted him from the beginning. It was a family resemblance. "The baby," he whispered, his gaze falling on the crying infant. "Noah." "He's not my son," Grace said, the final devastating truth falling between them. "He's yours." The words hung in the air, monstrous and unbelievable. His son, the son he had mourned for 5 years, the son he had buried alongside his wife. He was alive. Sarah wouldn't, he started, his mind refusing to accept it. She wouldn't leave her son. She wouldn't have a choice if someone took her, Grace cried. After she left here, she was supposed to send for him, but she never did. Something happened to her. Someone stopped her. Suddenly the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Reynolds's obsession with his land, his constant goading presence, his sneering reference to the resemblance. It was never about the land, it was about Sarah. Reynolds knew. He had known all along. Jacob looked at Grace, at the fire and grief in her eyes, and saw not an enemy, but the only other person in the world who had loved Sarah. And he saw the terrible truth. They had both been manipulated. They had both been played as pawns in a much darker game. Reynolds, Jacob said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He has her. Grace's breath hitched. The hatred for him in her eyes was replaced by a dawning, shared horror. The attack on the ranch, the rumors, the attempt to take Noah, it was all a distraction, a way to keep Jacob occupied, to drive Grace away, to bury the secret of what really happened to Sarah Carter 5 years ago. Jacob straightened up, the grief and confusion in his mind sharpening into a single, deadly point of purpose. He had been mourning a ghost while his wife was a prisoner. He had been raising a stranger's child while his own son slept under his roof. The war with Silas Reynolds was not over. It had just truly begun. And this time, it wasn't for land or honor. It was to get his family back. The plan was desperate, born from the ashes of Jacob's shattered world. He had to get to Dr. Albright. The old doctor had retired years ago, living out his days in a haze of whiskey at the edge of town, his reputation in tatters. He was the one who had signed Sarah's death certificate. He was the key. Jacob left Grace in the cabin with a rifle and a grim promise. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Her eyes, so recently filled with accusation, were now wide with a shared, terrifying purpose. She nodded, clutching Noah, her nephew, his son, tightly. The town was quiet, huddled against the relentless cold. Jacob found Albright in the back room of the saloon, a stooped figure reeking of cheap liquor. It took a bottle of the best whiskey and a grip of iron on the old man's collar, but the story finally came spilling out, laced with guilt and fear. Reynolds paid me, Albright croaked, his eyes darting around the empty room. Paid me a fortune. He knew Sarah was unhappy. He preyed on her fear, telling her you'd never let her leave. He convinced her to run, to let me pronounce her and the baby dead. He promised he'd take her somewhere safe, away from you. Where? Jacob's voice was a low growl. Where did he take her? I don't know, the doctor cried, shrinking back. He was supposed to take her east, but he came back a few weeks later, alone. He told me she'd had a change of heart and left him. But he was different, colder. He said if I ever spoke a word of it, he'd bury me in an unmarked grave. He hadn't taken her east. He had kept her. All this time she'd been close, a prisoner. The puzzle pieces were assembling into a monstrous picture. Reynolds's obsession, his hatred, it was the fury of a spurned lover. He hadn't helped Sarah escape. He had stolen her. Jacob returned to the ranch under the cloak of darkness, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He found Grace pacing the cabin floor, a sentinel guarding his son. He told her everything. He has her somewhere on his property, Jacob concluded, his voice flat and hard. The old abandoned homestead on the North Ridge. It's isolated. No one ever goes there. We have to tell the sheriff, Grace insisted. Jacob shook his head. The sheriff is in Reynolds' pocket, and Albright's testimony is worthless. He's a known drunk. They'll call us crazy. No, we're going to get her ourselves. It was suicide. Reynolds had more men, more guns. But looking at Jacob's face, Grace saw a man who had already lost everything once. He had nothing left to fear. What's the plan? She asked, her voice steady. He's expecting another attack from me, Jacob said. A frontal assault on his main ranch house. He'll have all his men there, waiting. But we're not going to the main house. He spread a map on the table. I'll take my most trusted men and create a diversion here, at the southern fence. We'll draw his riders out. While they're occupied, you and we go to the homestead." Grace stared at him. "Me? He won't be expecting a woman. And more than that," Jacob said, his gaze meeting hers, raw and honest, "I can't do this without you. She's your sister." The night was unnaturally still, the world holding its breath. Jacob and a small group of his most loyal hands rode out, their faces grim. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and riding toward a fight they might not survive. An hour later, the distant sound of gunfire echoed across the plains. The diversion had begun. Jacob slipped back to the cabin, his face a shadow in the moonlight. He helped Grace onto a waiting horse, her movements sure and steady. She had tucked Noah safely into bed under the watchful, worried eyes of Mrs. Hill. They rode north, away from the sounds of battle, their horses' hooves muffled by the snow. The homestead was a dark silhouette against the star-strewn sky, a place of forgotten memories and terrible secrets. They dismounted, moving like ghosts through the snow-choked yard. A single light burned in a downstairs window. Jacob peered through the grimy glass. A lone guard sat at a table, a bottle of whiskey beside him, his head nodding with sleep. Inside, a fire crackled, and chained to the hearth like an animal was a woman. Her hair was matted and streaked with gray. Her clothes were rags, but even through the dirt and despair, he knew her. It was Sarah. Grace stifled a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The years of not knowing, of fearing the worst, had not prepared her for this. Jacob's hand closed over hers, his grip like steel. He drew his pistol. His expression was no longer that of a rancher or a father. It was the face of pure, cold retribution. He kicked the door in. The guard jolted awake, fumbling for his gun, but Jacob was already on him, a silent, brutal force. The fight was over in seconds. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide and vacant with shock. She stared at Jacob as if he were an apparition. "Jacob?" she whispered, her voice a dry, unused rasp. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands fumbling with the heavy iron lock on her chains. It wouldn't budge. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through him. He saw a heavy poker by the hearth, and with a guttural roar, he slammed it against the chain. Again and again, the sound of metal on metal ringing through the small, squalid room. With a final, desperate heave, the chain snapped. Sarah stumbled forward into his arms, her body frail, her sobs racking her thin frame. Grace rushed to her side, and the two sisters clung to each other, a reunion steeped in 5 years of pain. "He told me you were dead," Sarah sobbed into Jacob's shoulder. "He said you died in the fire he set." The line shack, the first move in his game. "He's a monster," she whispered. Footsteps crunched in the snow outside. A familiar, mocking voice called out, "Well, well, a family reunion." Silas Reynolds stood in the doorway, a rifle cradled in his arms, his face contorted into a mask of triumph and madness. The gunshots to the south had stopped. The diversion was over. He had known all along. It had all been a trap. "Did you really think it would be that easy, Carter?" Reynolds sneered, his eyes glittering. "I've waited 5 years for this. She was mine. She would have learned to love me. But you always ruin everything." He raised the rifle, aiming it directly at Jacob's heart. "Now you get to die knowing I'll have her forever." Behind Reynolds, more of his men were appearing, their guns glinting in the moonlight. They were surrounded, trapped. Jacob pushed Sarah and Grace behind him, shielding them with his body. He had found his wife, but he had led them all into a slaughter. Reynolds' finger tightened on the trigger, and in that split second, the world exploded. A shot rang out, not from Reynolds' rifle, but from the darkness behind him. One of his men cried out and crumpled to the ground. Then another shot and another. From the trees surrounding the homestead, flashes of gunfire erupted. The ranch hands Jacob had sent for the diversion. They hadn't been beaten. They had circled back. They had followed him. Reynolds spun around, his face a mask of disbelief, as his men were picked off one by one. He was caught between two fronts, his trap sprung on himself. He let out a roar of pure fury and turned the rifle back on Jacob. But it was too late. Jacob charged, tackling him to the ground. The two men rolled in the snow and mud, a tangle of desperate, brutal violence. It wasn't a fight for land anymore. It was a fight for a soul. Jacob's fist landed with the force of 5 years of grief and rage. When it was over, Reynolds lay broken and defeated in the dirt. The sheriff arrived, as always, after the fighting was done. But this time, there was no denying the truth. He saw Sarah, alive but emaciated. He saw the chains. He saw the armed men. He saw Reynolds beaten and exposed. The law, however bent, was finally forced to be just. As they dragged Reynolds away, he locked eyes with Jacob one last time, his face a ruin of hatred. "She was never yours," he spat. "No," Jacob said, his voice quiet as he helped Sarah to her feet. "She was never property to be owned." Back at the Carter Ranch, the sun was rising, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of rose and gold. It was Christmas morning. The reunion was quiet, fragile. Sarah held her son for the first time, her tears falling onto his soft blanket. Annie stared at the strange woman who was her mother, a ghost made real. Grace stood by, the loyal sister who had risked everything. The wounds were deep. The years of lies and pain had left scars that would never fully fade. But as Jacob looked at his family, together under one roof, he felt a peace he thought he would never know again. Mrs. Hill, her stern face softened by tears, brought in a tray of hot coffee. The ranch hands, weary and bruised, gathered in the main room, their quiet respect a testament to the family they had fought to save. Grace sat by the fire, a piece of charcoal in her hand. She wasn't sketching a horse this time. She was sketching a family. A broken, battered, beautiful family, pieced back together in the heart of a Wyoming winter. Jacob came and stood behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Their journey had started with a lie, but it had ended with a truth more powerful than any deception. They had faced the storm and survived. They had found their way home. They found their justice, not in a courtroom, but in the quiet, simple fact of being together. A family forged in fire and secrets, finally free. If you believe that even the darkest nights can end with a sunrise, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories coming, and you won't want to miss them.